May 1st, 1960. The sky above Sverdlovsk was a perfect, merciless blue. At 70,000 feet, where the air is too thin to breathe and the temperature falls below -60, a silver shape glided silently through the stratosphere. No contrail, no roar, only the faint shimmer of sunlight off wings longer than a cathedral's roof. Far below, Soviet radar operators sat in concrete bunkers, tracing invisible arcs across cathode screens. They were looking for aircraft, for intruders, for anything that dared to cross the sacred airspace of the motherland. For hours they saw nothing. Then, at 8:43 a.m., a faint blip appeared, too slow for a meteor, too high for any plane they knew. The technicians adjusted their dials, confused. It was moving across central Russia, toward Moscow. "Impossible," one of them whispered. "Nothing flies that high." But something did. A lone aircraft, built not for battle but for vision, was slicing through the upper atmosphere. It carried no bombs, no guns, only cameras capable of reading license plates from the edge of space. Below it stretched an empire that prided itself on impenetrable defenses, missiles, radar nets, interceptor squadrons, but all were blind to the world above 60,000 feet. The Americans called it Project Aquatone. The Soviets called it a myth. On that morning, it became reality. The Soviets had conquered half the Earth, the narrator's voice might say, but they had never conquered altitude. The story of the U-2 began not in Washington or the Pentagon, but in a dusty hangar in Burbank, California. Inside an unmarked building behind Lockheed's main plant, a small team of engineers worked under a project so secret that even their families didn't know what they were building. Their leader was a man named Clarence Kelly Johnson, the quiet genius behind the P-38 Lightning and the sleek F-104 Starfighter. Johnson believed that technology could achieve what strategy could not. In the new atomic age, he said, the winner won't be the nation with the most bombs, it'll be the one that can see the furthest. The year was 1954. The Cold War had frozen the world into two armed camps, and the United States knew almost nothing about what lay behind the Iron Curtain. Soviet secrecy was absolute. No reconnaissance flights, no photographs, only rumors and satellite estimates. To prevent surprise, the U.S. needed eyes that could see across continents. When Johnson proposed an aircraft that could fly at 70,000 feet, the Air Force called it impossible. Jet engines stalled in air that thin. Metal structures cracked from temperature extremes. Human pilots couldn't survive without pressure suits. Johnson smiled and said, "Then we'll build one that shouldn't exist." Inside Lockheed's Skunk Works, they began designing something the world had never seen. A machine halfway between a glider and a jet, so light that even gravity would struggle to pull it down. Its wings stretched over 80 feet, slender as razors, lifting a fuselage barely wide enough for a single man. The aircraft would carry no armor, no weapons, no redundancy, just a camera so powerful it could photograph a city from the edge of space. At its heart was the Pratt & Whitney J57 engine, modified to breathe in near vacuum. It didn't roar like a fighter, it whispered, burning clean and cold, pushing the plane at 500 miles per hour, where air pressure was 1/8 that of sea level. The U-2 was not a warplane, it was a camera with wings. In an age when military power meant mass and speed, the U-2 was a contradiction. It wasn't fast enough to outrun fighters, not strong enough to resist missiles. Its defense was altitude, its faith, invisibility. Each component followed a single philosophy: efficiency over strength. The skin of the aircraft was a miracle of metallurgy. Thin aluminum alloys stretched to their limits, capable of withstanding both Arctic cold and tropical heat. Every rivet mattered. Every ounce saved meant another 100 feet of altitude. Even the cockpit was designed as a bubble of fragility, pressurized, barely insulated, with a tiny window through which the world appeared curved and distant. Kelly Johnson demanded simplicity. "Build it so that one pilot can take it apart with a wrench," he told his engineers. They used standardized components wherever possible, borrowing from commercial aviation. What couldn't be built by the book was handcrafted by artisans who worked in silence behind locked doors. By 1956, The prototype rolled out under the California sun unmarked, silver, anonymous. To the untrained eye, it looked fragile, almost toy-like. To those who knew, it was the most advanced aircraft ever created. The Central Intelligence Agency took control of the program, renaming it Project Aquatone. Its pilots were handpicked, Air Force veterans trained not as warriors but as observers. They were told they would fly alone, above every gun and missile, in air so thin that one wrong movement could tear the wings from the fuselage. The mission profile was breathtaking. Fly from secret bases in Turkey, Pakistan, or Alaska. Cross the Soviet border at dawn. Photograph missile silos, airfields, and industrial zones, and exit undetected before noon. Each flight would last 9 hours. Each flight was, officially, impossible. The first missions stunned American intelligence. From 70,000 feet, the U-2 captured entire Soviet cities in single frames. Factories, test sites, and nuclear facilities that had been shrouded in secrecy now appeared with photographic clarity. For the first time, Washington knew the truth. The Soviet bomber gap was a myth. Their missile program lagged behind. The threat, while real, was not infinite. It was the ultimate triumph of technology over ideology. The U-2 didn't win battles, one CIA officer said later. It prevented them. But while American intelligence celebrated, somewhere deep inside the Soviet Union, something else was happening. Radar stations were picking up traces, faint intermittent signals from altitudes their instruments were never designed to measure. Each one lasted only minutes, sometimes seconds, before vanishing into the upper atmosphere. To the men watching the green glow of their screens, it felt like ghosts were crossing the sky. And so, quietly, the Soviets began to ask a question that would haunt them. If something is flying over Moscow, how do we bring it down? Somewhere outside Moscow, 1957, a snowstorm swept across an airfield where rows of MiG fighters sat half buried in frost. Inside a low concrete building, radar operators stared at cathode screens glowing like ghostly moons in the dark. They had built a network the most expansive radar net on Earth, stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific. A wall of radio waves, an empire of detection. Nothing, they believed, could cross it unseen. But at 70,000 feet, radio waves began to bend and fade. Above 60,000, the thin air distorted returns. At 70,000, they vanished completely. To the men of the Soviet Air Defense Force, that altitude wasn't merely high, it was mythological. There are no aircraft there, one officer said. Only angels and meteors. Yet the angels, it seemed, were carrying cameras. Between 1,956 and 1,959, the Soviet Union recorded dozens of radar anomalies, faint echoes, moving in straight lines across strategic regions. Missile test sites, air bases, nuclear reactors. Intercept attempts failed. MiG-17 seconds climbed until their engines starved for oxygen. MiG-19 seconds flickered and stalled above 55,000 feet. Each failure bruised Soviet pride deeper than the last. In a report to Moscow, one general wrote, "We can build rockets that touch space, but we cannot protect our own sky." That was the paradox of the Red Empire. It could launch Sputnik, the world's first satellite, but could not stop a single silver ghost from crossing its heart. Inside OKB design bureaus, engineers studied fragments of American technology, retrieved from border incidents, bits of camera film, scraps of lightweight alloy, strange synthetic rubbers that resisted cold. They were baffled. The Americans were building machines with materials that didn't yet exist in Soviet catalogs. Their metals were purer, their cameras smaller, their circuits free of vacuum tubes. A Soviet metallurgist examined an American alloy sample and muttered, "They've learned to make steel that thinks it's paper." The Soviet Union's strength was quantity. Its industries were vast, its foundries relentless. It could produce tanks, artillery, and aircraft by the thousands. But it could not yet produce precision at the American level. Factories in Sverdlovsk and Magnitogorsk still used manual milling machines where Americans used automated cutters. Soviet optical lenses were ground by hand. American lenses came from industrial presses, measured in microns. Every advantage in altitude was the result of decades of industrial philosophy, not engineering luck. Meanwhile, radar engineers under General Sergei Savitsky raced to extend their reach. They experimented with new high-frequency systems, the P-35 bar lock and Dinester M arrays powerful enough to scan the upper atmosphere. But every improvement revealed another weakness. At 70,000 feet, the curvature of the Earth itself became an obstacle. No radar could see beyond the horizon. To catch the ghost, the Soviets would need something that could shoot blindly into the stratosphere. The answer was missiles. In 1958, the first S-75 Divina batteries were deployed long, white, needle-shaped rockets, guided by radar, capable of reaching the edge of space. They were the pride of Soviet science, the guardians of the homeland. But even then, no one was certain if they could hit something as small and high as the American intruder. The Dvina could reach 70,000 feet in theory, but theory is not the sky. That was the Soviet dilemma. They had the will, the weapons, and the ideology, but not the altitude. And so the invisible war continued. Every few weeks, a silent aircraft would cross the borders, take its photographs, and vanish into the upper atmosphere before a single MiG could climb to meet it. In the Kremlin, reports piled on Stalin's successor's desk, maps marked with flight paths, photographs of missile sites taken from above. The humiliation was unbearable. Marshal Semyon Zakharov said bitterly, "They are flying over our mothers and wives, and we can do nothing but watch." To the Americans, these flights were scientific triumphs. To the Soviets, they were psychological warfare. Each photograph was a statement. We see you. We know you. You cannot hide behind the Iron Curtain forever. And so, by 1960, the question in Moscow was no longer if they would bring one down but when. May 1st, 1960. Peshawar Air Base, Pakistan. The morning sun glowed orange over the mountains as a slender aircraft rolled onto the runway. Its wings stretched impossibly wide, casting thin shadows over the tarmac. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, climbed into the cramped cockpit, wearing a silver pressure suit that made him look less like a soldier than an astronaut. He was 30 years old, quiet, methodical, the kind of man chosen not for bravery, but for precision. Inside the suit, he could barely move. His oxygen line hissed softly. The air smelled of plastic and metal. Outside, technicians in unmarked uniforms secured the canopy. There were no insignias, no flags. If captured, he would not exist. At 6 a.m., the tower cleared him for takeoff. The U-2C accelerated slowly, its long wings gathering lift like a bird reluctant to leave the ground. At 140 knots, it rose smoothly into the thin morning air, climbing toward the edge of visibility. Passing 40,000 feet, Powers reported. All systems nominal. He would fly from Pakistan across the heart of the Soviet Union, photographing missile installations in the Urals, then exit north through Norway, 9 hours in the sky, alone, above every defense the Soviets had. At 70,500 feet, the world was black above and curved below. The horizon bent like glass. Powers could see the faint glow of dawn spreading over the Earth's rim. From that height, cities looked like tiny clusters of silver dust. Rivers glimmered like threads of mercury. His camera clicked rhythmically, every frame a secret. The aircraft was steady, silent, obedient. Every movement had to be precise. A slight roll could cause a stall. A small change in pitch could shatter the fragile wings. He flew in what pilots called the coffin corner, the narrow band between stall speed and overspeed, where one extra knot could mean death. At that altitude, safety margins were measured in inches of air pressure. The U-2 was both a miracle and a trap. Far below, radar stations in Soviet Central Command began to light up. At first, faint echoes, then stronger. By 8:40 a.m., the unidentified target appeared clearly on multiple screens. The duty officer in Sverdlovsk reported, target altitude estimated at 21 kilometers, heading north. Within minutes, the order came from Moscow. Destroy the intruder. Dozens of MiG-19 scrambled from nearby bases, their afterburners roaring into the thin air. But as they climbed, engines began to cough, stall, and flame out. None could reach the intruder's height. One frustrated pilot transmitted over the radio. "I see him a small glint, far above. He is beyond us." The Soviets turned to their new weapon, the S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile. 3 launch sites around Sverdlovsk, locked onto the radar trace. Technicians in headphones calibrated guidance systems, the radar beams trembling like invisible swords through the sky. At 8:53 a.m., the command was given. Pusk. Fire. A column of smoke erupted from the forest. The missile rose, its exhaust carving a white scar into the blue. Then another. And another. Powers saw nothing. The sky above 70,000 feet is too thin for sound. But suddenly, a flash, then vibration. A shockwave rippled through the fuselage. The right wing tore apart. Pressure plummeted. His suit inflated violently as shards of metal spun past his visor. The U-2 broke into fragments, falling silently through the stratosphere like confetti of silver leaves. On the ground, Soviet villagers saw streaks of light falling from the sky. One piece crashed near Sverdlovsk, another burned in the fields beyond. By afternoon, local troops surrounded the wreckage. Among the twisted metal, they found a parachute and a man tangled within it, bruised but alive. Francis Gary Powers. The Americans had always said the U-2 could fly higher than any missile. That morning, the Dvina proved otherwise. But for Soviet engineers who gathered around the wreckage later that day, the moment was not only victory, it was revelation. The wrecked fuselage told a story. Each aluminum beam, each wire, each rivet whispered a truth about American industry. They saw simplicity where they expected complexity. They saw lightness where they expected armor. They saw transistors, tiny, solid-state devices that replaced their bulky vacuum tubes. And someone murmured, almost in disbelief, "This isn't built by soldiers. It's built by scientists." The Soviet military celebrated. The intruder had been destroyed. The Americans humiliated. But in the quiet of engineering rooms, another realization settled in. They had won a battle in the sky, but lost the race on Earth, the race of technology, philosophy, and production. They could build missiles powerful enough to touch the heavens, but America had built a machine precise enough to live there. May 1st, 1960, Sverdlovsk, USSR. The explosion echoed faintly through the upper atmosphere, like thunder trapped in glass. Fragments of silver metal spiraled downward, trailing thin threads of smoke. In Moscow, telephones began to ring. The Air Defense Command reported an unidentified aircraft destroyed over central Russia. There were cheers in the Kremlin corridors. After 4 years of humiliation, the intruder was finally gone. But the victory was not as clean as it seemed. On the ground near Degtyarsk, soldiers from the 4th Anti-Air Regiment waded through birch forests and fields, still dusted with snow. They found wreckage scattered over 12 kilometers, torn aluminum, blackened film reels, oxygen tanks split like fruit. But among the debris, something extraordinary. A cockpit seat, a parachute, and footprints in the mud. By noon, local militia had captured a man walking along a dirt road, dazed and limping, his pressure suit half torn. When questioned, he said little. He had no identification, no rank insignia. Only a silver ring, engraved G.P. Within hours, he was flown to Moscow under armed guard. His name, they would soon learn, was Francis Gary Powers, U.S. Air Force captain, operating under CIA orders. The Americans had said their aircraft was for weather research. The Soviets now held proof that the sky itself had been a battlefield. The wreckage was moved to a hangar at Kuznetsov Air Base under heavy security. Dozens of engineers and intelligence officers gathered to examine what the Americans had built. To the untrained eye, it looked almost primitive. A long, narrow fuselage, wings, fragile as gliders. But to those who understood aviation, it was revelation. The first thing they noticed was the skin, a dull gray metal, light enough to flex between fingers. Not aluminum, not steel. A magnesium alloy so pure and thin that Soviet factories could not yet reproduce it in sheets this uniform. Then the wiring insulated with a strange plastic-like compound that resisted both heat and moisture. American synthetic polymers, decades ahead of Soviet equivalents. And the camera a marvel, lenses ground to near perfection, mounted in vibration-damping frames, film spools that could capture entire cities in a single pass. Every component labeled, every wire color-coded. The craftsmanship was methodical, almost obsessive. One engineer, Colonel Viktor Kondratyev, remembered later, it was as if they had built a Stradivarius to fight a war. The Americans had designed the U-2 not as a weapon, but as an instrument precise, fragile, utterly logical. Every inch of its structure served one purpose: to see farther than anyone else. The Soviets, by contrast, had built aircraft to survive. Thick skins, armored cockpits, redundancy in every system. They built machines that could endure bullets. The Americans built one that could endure gravity itself. Technicians laid out fragments of the U-2's camera film under magnifiers. Even burned and torn, the images it had taken before destruction were clear missile fields, air bases, industrial zones, each frame sharp enough to identify license plates. The realization spread through the analysis room like a chill. For years, the Americans had been flying over their most secret installations, not once or twice, but dozens of times. They hadn't simply seen Soviet power. They had measured it. Every silo, every launch pad, every runway catalogued with mathematical precision. The entire Soviet strategic order of battle had been mapped from above. What Moscow called secrecy, Washington called data. Back in the Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev faced a dilemma. The May Day parades were underway. The eyes of the world were on Moscow. He could either admit the truth or let the Americans continue to claim a missing weather plane. For days, Washington insisted the aircraft was civilian, so Khrushchev waited. Then, on May 7th, he stepped before the Supreme Soviet and delivered his speech. "I must inform you," he said, "that we have not only the wreckage of the aircraft, we have the pilot." The chamber erupted in applause. The trap was complete, the lie exposed. In the White House, President Eisenhower faced an impossible choice. To deny the mission would make America appear cowardly. To admit it would risk war. He chose the truth, or at least, the part of it he could afford to tell. "Yes," he said, "the flight was authorized. It was a necessary measure for national security. It was the first public acknowledgement of the U-2 program and the end of it." The planned Paris summit collapsed in anger. Khrushchev stormed out before Eisenhower could speak. The Cold War deepened, now fought as much in laboratories as on battlefields. But far from politics, deep in Soviet testing facilities, the engineers continued their quiet work. They stripped every remaining fragment of the U-2, weighing, measuring, testing. They copied the wing profiles, the pressure suit design, the camera systems. But what they couldn't copy was the invisible thing, the thought behind the metal. That thought wasn't about perfection. It was about function. It wasn't about strength. It was about efficiency. It was, above all, about building for use, not for glory. It would take decades for the Soviet Union to understand what it had truly seen that spring morning. The U-2 wasn't just an airplane. It was a philosophy, distilled into aluminum and wire. The Americans had learned that victory in the modern world didn't belong to the strongest nation, but to the most informed one. Knowledge was power literally, mathematically, industrially. In the archives of the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, a note was later found, scribbled by a Soviet engineer in 1961. Their genius is not the machine itself. It is the factory that builds it, and the worker who can replace its parts without guessing. That was the essence of the American advantage. They had industrialized precision. They had turned complexity into something reproducible. Where Soviet engineers prized craftsmanship, Americans prized consistency. Where the USSR sought individual brilliance, The U.S. invested in systemic reliability. One built heroes, the other built factories. By 1962, the Soviets had their own high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, the Yak-25RV Mandrake, but it could barely reach 60,000 feet. The Americans had already moved on. Their new machines didn't even need pilots. Satellites, guided by computers smaller than a briefcase, could orbit the Earth and photograph entire continents. The U-2 was just the beginning, the bridge between the age of flight and the age of information. The same technology that had terrified the Kremlin would later power civilian mapping, weather forecasting, and space exploration. It was no longer about who could fly higher. It was about who could see clearer. Francis Gary Powers spent nearly 2 years in Soviet custody before being exchanged for KGB spy Rudolf Abel on a Berlin bridge in 1962. He returned home to suspicion, not celebration. The public saw a man who had fallen, not one who had survived, but history would vindicate him. His flight, though doomed, had exposed both the limits and the ambitions of two superpowers, one reaching for the sky, the other trying to bring it down. He later said quietly in an interview, "We weren't fighting each other with bullets anymore. We were fighting for understanding." And perhaps that was the truest lesson of the U-2. It wasn't a story about espionage or heroism. It was a story about perspective. The Americans had looked down from 70,000 feet and seen the future not through ideology, but through clarity. They built machines that reflected their civilization. Clean, precise, efficient, adaptable. The Soviets built machines that reflected theirs. Massive, powerful, determined, but brittle under pressure. One designed for dominance, the other for endurance. Only one understood that information itself could be a weapon more powerful than any bomb. In the end, when Soviet generals looked at the shattered remains of the U-2, what they truly saw wasn't an aircraft. They saw a mirror reflecting the difference between two worlds. A nation that built things to last, and a nation that built things to learn. The Soviets never expected the U-2 to fly over Moscow, but it did. And in doing so, it didn't just capture images of their cities. It captured the limits of their imagination.